glad to have you today. As you can see, we have a pretty long topic there, school and workplace recovery, finding a place to work and learn post-national natural disasters. I think when we look at those events, we've seen a lot of things happening, and we're going to go through behind the scenes and talk about what does it mean to you if this was your school and where it occurred. Next up, we would like you to become our friends on social media. At Twitter, it's at Firestorm Soul, and on Facebook, Firestorm Solutions. There is a hashtag for this session, and that's hashtag Crisis Coach. You can post comments there or ask questions. You can also use the little toolbar to the right if you've got a question, and we'll try to work as many answers in as we can. Firestorm transforms crisis into value. Firestorm empowers you to manage crisis and risk. Firestorm's expertise is in crisis management, critical decision support, crisis communications, crisis public relations, and consequence management. We're America's crisis coach, and again, we are looking at a predict, plan, perform methodology, and you'll hear more about that as we get in today's webinar. We have attorneys just like everybody else, and they love to have disclaimers, so here's ours. You need to have the oral comment today. Any work product must be read in conjunction with guidance from your legal counsel and other authorities, and everything we're saying today should not be interpreted as legal advice or legal opinion. I'm an engineer, so that means I'm probably not an attorney. So we're very fortunate today to have Kim Fallon with us, the Director of Administrative Programming and Communications for the Virginia Association of Independent Schools. So over to you, Kim. Any observations for us today?
No, other than we continue to enjoy our relationship with Firestorm, and we just last week sent out some really good information for our members within VAIS about the program and the kinds of really important work that Firestorm does and the value that they bring to our membership. So thank you again for this continued collaboration.
Well, Kim, thanks. Any upcoming events in the Virginia Association that we should point out?
Absolutely. We have our annual conference, which will be taking place on Monday, November 6th, and that's for heads of schools, teachers, and academic administrators, and that will be taking place here in Richmond, Virginia. So November 6th, and we look forward to welcoming everybody to Richmond.
Well, it's a great place to go, and the networking opportunities to find out what your peers are doing about the types of problems that you see in your school is a great opportunity for everyone to experience that together. And I would encourage you to make sure that you're there. If you want to see the past webinars that we've recorded, you can go to firestorm.com. There is an on-demand access, so you can look at the previous topics. You can also go there and register for future events. So let's get started. As we look at it, there I am, Jim Satterfield. I'm the president of Firestorm, and that day I looked like I was happy. And that's a good thing to be, because in many cases when we're talking about the materials that we're talking about, it can be a different look. This is a survey we did of, I think it was about 500. And if you look at it, and you look at the percentages here, you'll see a lot of these things are relating to violence, 25% in that combined area. Sometimes that goes over and talks about a loss of life event. You'll see another 6. Cyber is an increasing exposure that we're seeing across the area, and now we're seeing schools specifically targeted in those areas, and that's a key element. Brand and reputation events that could really relate to any of these areas and coming together. But the big 24% there, natural disaster, devastation, and I think the devastation word there is certainly well placed as we think about the events that have just occurred. And whether it's the hurricanes or a potential earthquake or the shootings in Las Vegas, those types of events certainly cause devastation and disruption. We want to focus today really on the natural disaster area, more than any other because it affects our facility, our students, and our teachers. And that's a combination that will be an extreme issue for all of us to deal with and pose a series of unique problems. So 1 in 4 in the survey indicated that's an area they were concerned about. I think if we did this survey now, post the hurricanes, you'd probably find that percentage going up significantly. So today, as you hear our conversation, I'd like you to think about what's our plan, what do we have in place, what would we like to put in place, what do we need to do right now, because the time to think about that isn't when you see the picture that's here. How robust is your continuity strategy? Think about that picture that's shown there. What would you do if this was your school? Now, in your situation, it might not be a hurricane, although it could come up the coast and dump lots of rain. Virginia has a great deal of coastal exposure, and we've seen hurricanes in the past go up the coast. Could be flooding from a river, but it could be a tornado that struck the building. Imagine, and look at the football field. I don't think they're going to be practicing on that field or playing their stands across the way there on that anytime soon. And that's the King High School football field. And this was from the Texas hurricane that came into play. So think about your campus right now and say, what would we do if our campus was physically impacted by some type of a natural event, tornado, flooding, any excessive events that occur to our facility? And when you think about it, this is out of Miami. This shows one of the cranes being split there where they were building a building. And as you think about that exposure, have you tested your plan? Have we tested what would we do if our facility was impacted? Have we thought about remote learning? Have we identified an alternative place that we could go and hold our classes at that point in time? Because the time to think about it is before the crane breaks, before something happens to your particular facility. What are you going to do and how are you going to do it? So we followed Irma in great detail as it came right up the center of Florida and through Georgia back into the Carolinas and the impacts associated with it. It was a significant event. And then you've seen it followed with the devastation that hit in Puerto Rico and then Maria and now another hurricane that has just come back into impacting the area around Biloxi and Alabama again. So those were 4 major tests in 1 year, and we found that most organizations, be they schools or businesses, did not have plans to deal with the facility impact and secondarily the human impact, because it's all the families of your students, it's all the families of your teachers. Those are all going to be impacted, and certainly that's going to have an impact back on the school. And when you start to think about not only the financial impacts, will our insurance cover us and get us back up and running? Do we have business interruption if suddenly we have to refund tuition because our school is non-operational? Where are we and what does this mean? The time to think about that is today and not the day after. So this is the update from a superintendent in I can't even pronounce the name correctly. I bet, Karen, you can do it. But the superintendent. Thank you. Sometimes when I have the wrong one, it's hard to get those things back. So if you look at it, a damage assessment, take a moment to think about the impact it had on the school, on a school exactly like yours. And then finally, how do we get back to school? That's the business that we're all in on the call today. How do we get back to school and back to operations and sending out those messages and maintaining the accreditation? So when you think about Harvey, Irma, Maria, and Nate, what's next? I pasted at the bottom of that picture of the hurricane, which looks particularly frightening when you see that satellite image and coming in, is your hazard impact matrix. And That includes not only natural disasters, but other types of things that could occur in your school area. And you would do a list of those, and you'd rate the probability from rare to unlikely, possible, probable, highly probable. And then you start to look at the severity, the event forewarning, the event duration, the human impact, the property impact, the operational impact. By the way, if you're impacting the property, you certainly are going to impact the operation. If your teachers aren't available, the human to come at those levels. So that creates a base risk level. So if everything was scored at the highest one, fives all across, your total number would come up to be 100%. That's your base risk level. The way you can mitigate those risks, because the risk is the risk. Now, if you've scored lower numbers, they would come back up. But if that totals 40% or more, those are risks that you need to have plans in place to deal with. So that's the first thing I want you to take away from our call today. So as you look at that, then you look at how do we mitigate it. Pre-action, putting plans in place, doing the things like we're talking about today, having the internal resources established, having your external resources, and those go to mitigate those scores and lower them. So something maybe have scored a 50 or 60, but if you have the mitigations in place, it's down below that threshold level and changing it. So that's where we want to start, thinking about each of these individual areas. So there are two types of damages that you see shown here. Direct harm to structures like buildings and their belongings inside, and indirect, causing people losing their income and jobs. What's going to be the impact on your school if businesses are closed down? Let's think about the pictures we're seeing right now coming out of Puerto Rico, looking at those areas. People aren't going to be working there. There's not going to be the areas to have in place. When you get these types of devastations, it's a physical impact and then it's a people impact. And we're going to tell you over and over in all of our discussions that family trumps job. So if we think about these types of impacts, let's see what's happening nationally. Insurance company Hanover Re is a very large company. As you know, reinsurers reinsure other insurance companies, because if you were the only person carrying the coverage and if this event hit, you would be out of business, and so you spread that risk. And JP Morgan had estimated what the impacts would be, and this is for Harvey. This isn't for Irma. This isn't for Maria. This isn't for Nate. It's Harvey alone. Higher gasoline prices. We certainly in Atlanta saw a major spike coming. We saw all those businesses impacted. And by the way, if you were a business, it might not have hit you, but it affected your supply chain. Those disruptions were significant. Certainly, I was startled to see the air traffic pictures where the planes were shut down in Irma, and you just had none of those events. If you look at the lighting, when the power was out with Irma and across Georgia and Florida, and you would see the night where normally there would be light, there was none. Ground transportation, if the roads are washed away, you can't get from point A to point B. And we're going to see it in our bill at the grocery store when you look at crop damages. But if it's $20 billion from Harvey, and it's over $100 billion from Irma, and then you add Maria and you add the others, these are devastating numbers. And for us to operate our schools and not anticipate that this is going to be a problem isn't a realistic expectation. So the question is, what happens if no one can get anywhere? If it's just totally washed out, no ability to go from point A to point B? And Karen shot this picture because this occurred, I think, down in the Charleston area, if I'm not mistaken, or this could have been a St. Simon's picture. I've seen so many that the devastation continues to look the way. But if this was a school bus route, if this is a route a parent was taking to come to your school, they're not doing that today. And those are going to be the real experiences that we have. It's not going to be school as usual. It's going to have to be school as unusual. Have you sat down within your school and started to talk about what you would do and how to make those things work? So if we're thinking about what our learning options are, important elements, we have to keep safety clearly in mind. We need a place to have it. We're not going to probably sit out in a parking lot and try to conduct school. We've got hygiene and health areas. You've got to have running water. You have to have sanitation. We have to feed our students, and then we have to have class. It looks like that's a fairly exciting Woodsboro sign there up, or a flag, but in Pride, but there has to be options that you can do, and those options could include remote learning. With technology today, if power was working, you could use that. Have you sat down in your school and said, how do we teach at home with our teachers being unable to go there? Can we set up an internet meeting and give a curriculum out, or coordinate those events? Do we have a church that we could go and set up and have classes? Do we send part of our students to one church and another part to a different church? Is there another facility in the area? Do we have a relationship with another school if they were not impacted, that maybe we could do something after their school day to fit in, or take over their gym or some other area to do it? What is your plan? Because with what we've seen with the events that have occurred over the last couple of months, not having a plan is not an option for your school. Now, we talk a lot in all of our webinars and events around the growing exposure for violence in our schools. And clearly the shootings in Las Vegas indicated, again, how susceptible all of us are to those things. And so the behaviors of concern, the behavioral risk threat assessment program, Bertha, that you have access to through the Virginia Association, is a good example of addressing those kinds of exposures. But what we're talking about here is your continuity of operations, or your business continuity, because you're in the business of education. How do we run our school if something's happened to our facility? That's a question that most schools didn't think about until they had these 4 events come in and put it at the center of everyone's mind. So if you look at the picture here, and imagine this was a neighborhood, and you look at the water around those homes. Anybody in those houses going to go to school? Will there be any teachers that will be heading out to get to your school? How will they get there? Are they going to wade through that water? Will those cars actually run? If there's students in those homes, how do we get to them? How do we get them to us? What do we need to do? And I think the emphasis in our discussions today really come back to this whole issue. What does this mean to us? What does it mean to the students that are in our schools? What is the impact associated with it? Karen, I haven't let you talk much, but I think this is a good time to do. When you were seeing all of this going on, what came first to your mind as you thought about it?
That's a good question, Jim. You know, there are 2 things here in this particular image, is that people may not be allowed back in their homes. So you may be within a 20-mile radius or 40-mile area radius, and your school facility is okay, but you don't have students and families because just a short distance away, the homes or properties are so damaged that people are not allowed back. Additionally, you may have backup power so that you can get your school back up and running, but again, those people may not. And the other thing that I was thinking of, and this came from a conversation I was having with one of our expert council members for an upcoming article. He had traveled down to Florida, and is a shelter manager. So when there is a crisis, he goes to various locations, and he'll run the shelter itself for however long they need him. And many of those shelters are in school facilities. I know in Hugo here in 1989, one of the shelters that everyone had evacuated to is one of the places that was hit worst of all. when the surge came in. It was rather tragic. So there's a consideration there of how do you get back to starting school when you have strangers in your building, because the shelter is still open because people are still trying to get themselves settled. I think it's an important question to ask, Jim.
And I agree, and I think we'll hit that again in a minute. The other comment that I wanted to emphasize is something you said, Karen, that we should think about. Have you put a system in place with all of your teachers and all of your students and their families so that they would tell you where they are if they have to relocate out of the area? Have you set up a Facebook account? Facebook is a wonderful place to do this, but you'd have training, set it up in advance, and ask them to post where they are and when they're expected back, because it would help you immensely in planning with them, coordinating, and getting the support to them. So knowing where your people are becomes a critical element. Now, we have a strategic partnership with Regis. You may or may not be familiar with Regis. Regis is they provide executive office space or temporary office space, and they're spread globally now, a massive organization, and they have what we would call it dynamic recovery. People can go to any Regis location and coming in, and so we regularly do surveys and do research accompanying them. If you look at this, you'll see this is what they found out in the business marketplace, and you need to understand where you are with who the vendors are, because we've been talking about students and teachers, but who are the vendors that help you at your school? Cleaning, food services, others, who are those suppliers? You'll see 9 had never demonstrated they have the ability to recovery. 40% relied that they're just going to try to do whatever's in their contract. 19 share some results. That means that 81% in a business environment are not even sharing their results, and you may never have known what your vendors can do. And only less than a third have ever shown that they can recover. Regis also shared that sometimes the location is too close to the site and the recovery. Sometimes it's too small. If you had to take all of the students in your school and take them someplace else and you had 500, you can't go to a place that can have 100. So how do you deal with those? Or it's too far or too difficult to go through. So having sites both that are close and that are far away, because you don't know if the entire area would be impacted, would make a difference. So I think that it's interesting here that the concepts that they're thinking about is that location. You'll also see the concern here around security. When you have an event like this as a natural disaster, unfortunately, not everyone has the best interest of you in that part. So physical security will become a higher level. You know about your school, maybe you have fencing around your campus, you have other elements, but in these situations where you have to relocate, you may not have that level of security. So when you consider any of these things, we would point out and have you think about the words decisions, actions, and words, because that's the most important thing. What are the decisions you're going to need to make? What are the actions that you're going to need to take? And what are the words that you're going to say? And you'll notice we use the word word as opposed to communications, because words really matter. Selecting those things make a significant difference. Now, I showed you the top of that hazard vulnerability matrix on an earlier slide, but that goes to the predict. Predict what the vulnerability is. What's its impact going to be? Plan the response. That was where you're starting to mitigate. That's the pre-action, and the internal and external resources. And then you have to be able to perform in doing that, supplies and emergency areas. Once you've set up those vulnerabilities, then we can deal with the impacts, understanding them on our people, on our property, and the onset and the capabilities and options that we've got. What is our strategy? And one of the things that we really haven't spent a lot of time in our webinars with schools on are the business continuity or continuity of operations issues. What do we do? Because there are 3 things that can happen. You can lose your facility, you can lose your people, and you could lose your technology. in the types of disasters that we've just seen, all three were impacted. So,
Hey, Jim.
Yes, ma'am.
I just wanted to make two small points. The first is when we look at that hazard vulnerability matrix, I think one of the first challenges is in that first box that says what is the potential for an event to occur. And if you're in disaster denial and you say, well, that's never going to happen here. We're never going to have a flood. There's never going to be a dam that's going to break. We're never going to have a hurricane come as close to us to cause big damage. That's where the challenge really starts, isn't it? With saying it is possible that something can occur here. And secondly, we have to remember that our schools are workplaces as well as school places. We have employees who count on our schools to provide them a living, from our support staff to the facilities management folks to our educators. So all of the information that we get on businesses in this regard really is applicable to our school environments as well.
And if you look at the events in Puerto Rico, it's certainly at a whole nother level. The infrastructure, the power grid, less than half the people have access to water, even now weeks later. Power and energy, it's not business as usual there. And while it's hard to imagine that that could happen in the U.S., Harvey, when it came in and hit in the Houston area, it wasn't the storm surge as much and the other elements. There was no driving force for the system, and it rained and it rained and it rained. And when you look at some of the counties there had over 50 inches of rain, not 50 inches of snow, 50 inches of rain, over 4 feet of water. When you think about those areas, even in your school, you will have a problem, you'll have a problem in your community, it's going to disrupt everything. So as we think about it, my question is remote learning feasible? Have you set up a plan? We'll send it out, we'll post it here, we'll give curriculum, we'll coordinate, we'll try, or we're going to go to this church down the way or this business or this warehouse, wherever it might be. Will it take? The word long was left out. How will it take? So it was so rushed I couldn't even get the word long in there. What can you do? If you look at the picture to the right there, that's the tornado that hit a school in Joplin. And that school is not going to be operational for a long time. So if these events would happen, and while I know that the association's headquartered in Richmond, a tornado in Richmond is not out of the question. I have family up in Hopewell, Virginia, and they've had tornadoes through in those areas. So it doesn't have to be the hurricane. The cause isn't as big of a concern as the impact. So point to consider. How do you continue operations with people working at home, another location? Are there any special requirements? What impact does the loss of utilities and communications have? Have you tested? And then the point that Karen raised earlier is what happens if your school is housing hundreds of people? Now, that's probably not as big an issue for the independent schools as it would be for the public schools, because the common good would require that they would be overtaken at that point to deal with it. But what's the staff that you need? What are the supplies that you need? We were working with a school not in the continental United States, and the heads of those schools, also an independent school system, said, well, we're going to come out here and sit under the trees and everybody's going to sit on the ground and we're just going to do school. And I think that's a healthy attitude, and I think it shows the idea that we have to think out of the box. What's the minimum that we need in order to have school? Now, we lived up in Baltimore, just up the road from you in Virginia, for a number of years. You wouldn't be sitting outside on the ground in January in Baltimore with snow. So if this event occurred, it has a seasonal impact. It has another element associated with it. Those are things to look at. And also, I would have someone look at your insurance. What is the insurance going to pay? I'd take the model and write a letter to my insurance broker asking them to identify what we would get at our school if this event happened and how would we recover. Do we have to refund tuition? Do we have that built into our insurance? Are we able to recover it? So take your own grid. If those aren't your staff or your needs, put up your own and start to develop it. And what do you need on day 1, day 3, day 7, day 14? How long before you feel you have to start school back before it becomes a material impact? And recognizing everybody that you're talking to is having a personal impact in their lives. Going back to Regis, we ask again how you go about choosing the right location. Now you've got to think about this chart, that they're thinking about it from a business standpoint. But every one of these things has a counterpart that would apply to you and your school. So we lifted that information and brought it over. So what does your list look like for your school? How close do you need to be? What's the size, the budget? Is this some area where you could have a flexible space where you can move it back and forth? Is there special securities? Do we need to be able to send mail, receive mails? What's the reliability that we need to be able to have? Now, those questions continue to grow, and think about people. Now, in a business environment, Regis is talking about the staff that you would have. You've got teachers. You have other security folks that might be involved, or administrative. What are their needs? How do we, if we're going to try to work from home, if we're going to go to remote learning, what would that look like in your school? Have you sat down and talked about it? Have you established that each teacher would set up a Facebook account, and every student in that class would then log into that Facebook area, invited there in an open format where you can share curriculum and you can do coaching and information that would come out? There are services that are available today that weren't available a number of years ago. Freeconferencecall.com. By the way, since it's free, it's certainly not a commercial for me to mention them specifically, has the ability to provide a call-in number that everybody can dial into, and you can have a conference call with up to 400 people on it. By the way, it also has the ability to have a web meeting where the teacher could put the curriculum up on their computer and the students could then see it via that. And again, that can have 400 people on that call. So there is a way today within a budget within your school to do, or having a continuity plan that outlines all of these things. And that's the type of thing that you have Ken Mercer, who is the Firestorm principal up in your area. Ken and Ryan Mercer would be glad to work with you in helping in each of those areas. So confirming your numbers, space and seat number. While Regis is talking about a business, seat number certainly applies to students in a classroom, and looking at how do those change over time. How are we going to take other activities in departments? Are we going to have a choir? Are we going to have a band? Are we going to try to do clubs and meetings? How do we make these decisions, and what are those processes looking like? You've got to sit down and have that laid out and confirm those. And again, what does your list look like? This is Regis telling you what it looks like in a business environment and what the numbers need to be. Now, in addition to those things, we not only have those, we have technology requirements. Most things that you could think of, if you had the ability to have it on a laptop or a computer at home, and you had access to cloud capabilities, I've given Facebook as an example, or GoToMeeting.com, that would give you the ability to have people have those capabilities put in place and sharing again, because we're in the middle of this crisis in each area. Now, we look at large organizations. By the way, Regis is a global firm and headquartered out of the UK, so their organization has an S and not a Z in it. But how many school days could you miss and still make sure that accreditation and other requirements are being met. Those are decisions to make, and to have those areas, privacy, storing of information, those types of obligations would need to be considered. Certainly some technology areas. Working from home, how would that impact the workers' compensation insurance that you have, or the general liability? Or if you're bringing people together, not in your school environment, will your insurance cover you at an alternative location, and how can you confirm that? And again, asking questions of your broker in writing and getting written comments back become absolutely critical. What do you look for in locations? And you've got to figure out your aspects of it. This is Regis again talking about their space. They have flex space, and in this particular example, you can see people working out in open areas. You're probably not going to find in a business environment a large contained area where you could do classrooms. I've mentioned churches many times because they have classrooms. They have the ability to handle a larger group, and that might be a good place to begin your thoughts. Or having reciprocal arrangements with schools in your state that are members of the association but not in your immediate area, because many times these disasters and events are tied to a specific location. So 50 miles away, as we were talking, might be sufficient to make that work. But if there's the kind of widespread impact that we're talking about, the roads may not be there, families may not be prepared to drive 50 miles to go to school associated with it. So in the aftermath of what we looked at, Regis just went ahead and offered free lounge access to businesses that were displaced. It's a great marketing move by Regis, because now people are saying, oh, we could have had this, we could have had private space. How do we make this work? And they responded to hundreds and hundreds of businesses, Hurricane Harvey, and even more as the others had come through. So I would challenge you to think about your school and what you know. What is your vulnerability list? What are your alternative locations? How do you communicate? How do we do school if our building is gone, if we cannot get there, is a critical question, and it's a real one that was faced by schools all through Florida and Georgia and Texas and Puerto Rico and other locations. It was overwhelming to see it. So if we think about it, there's going to be a brief, and by the way, every time you attend Firestorm Virginia Association schools, there's always a brief around the topic, and you can go, and it'll be up next week on our website. So you go to firestorm.com/briefs, and you'll get the school workplace recovery brief from this webinar. It'll show you some of the slides. It'll reference some of the suggestions that we've got, and you'll find it as a helpful tool to begin to have that information that you can share. There also will be a recording of this webinar if you'd like to share it with others within your school to think about this topic. So let's kind of pull our thoughts together at the end. And Kim, I'm going to give you an opportunity to give us your insights and share with us anything that you think of when you heard our discussion so far today.
Thanks so much. We really are going to take a look at everything that you've offered today and really try and offer those resources to our folks because, you know, it is scary. I know when you mentioned about hurricanes coming through or tornadoes or whatever, you know, those do exist here in Virginia, and we've been, knock on wood, lucky in the last year or two that we haven't had that kind of a tragedy come through, but we definitely want our folks to be very prepared, and I think you've done a thorough job of giving the step-by-step of some of the many things they need to think about to be prepared in that kind of a crisis.
Well, thank you. I think it's an area where people just don't want to see what this could mean. And when you say Harvey and Irma and Maria and Nate, Las Vegas shootings, we can't turn a blind eye. We can't assume that it's going to be business as usual for our schools. I think we're going to have to assume that we're going to be at a point where it's not going to be that way. And if it's under your responsibility, you're on the webinar today or you're listening to it recorded, and you've got responsibilities at your school. When these events happen, and unfortunately we've just seen in the last 60 plus days, all of these things happening at the worst possible level to not hundreds, not thousands, but millions of people. And we've been reviewing these every Friday. We have an internal Firestorm call where we're reviewing what's going on and what needs to be done. We talked about the words that if you had to summarize all of these things up in a word, and horrible, horrendous, and the other word is hopeless. People can become hopeless in these types of situations if there isn't a plan. Anything you can plan for now, you can mitigate those impacts. That's why that hazard vulnerability assessment, with taking a look at what the plans are, the pre-action that you can put into place. What are our internal resources? What are our external resources? We currently are working in the healthcare area because there's a new requirement that's in place for 17 different categories of medical facilities around the country. And this is put in place by Medicare and Medicaid because in their analysis, they found that those facilities were not ready if the disaster happened to them. And the only way that Medicare and Medicaid can have any impact is they told those facilities, if you don't have your plans in place and if they're not tested by November 15th, you'll lose the ability to receive Medicare and Medicaid funding. Well, nobody's coming to your school today to say you're going to lose funding if you don't have these plans in place. But if you look at everything that's happened in the last 60 days, if you look at what the government has identified as the exposure in healthcare facilities, how much more critical is it to make sure that we have these things in place in our schools? Now, you're an independent school. You're not subject to what the state thinks it needs to put into place or the government needs to think that puts in place. But you're held to a much higher standard because at the end of the day, you're going to have to pick up the phone and call a family and talk to them about what's happening to their child. Now, if it had been that tornado and children died, imagine the pressure to make that phone call to that home to say, your son or your daughter's not coming home today. And if you find that you can't run your school because of these natural disasters or other events, are you going to refund the tuition for the year? Are you going to be able to pay the teachers? Are you going to be able to help the students advance from this grade to the next? These are significant risk and exposures. You can't ignore them. We could ignore them maybe some before because in America we have short-term memories. We don't have a long-term vision of what's going to happen. But you couldn't have looked on the internet, picked up a newspaper, or turned on a television set and seen the devastation without saying, this is going to mean something and we need to do something about it. So with that in mind, I leave you today. If you've got a question, you can go to firestorm.com and contact us, or you can send us an email at webinars@firestorm.com, or you can pick up the phone and call us at 800-321-2219. We didn't get to questions, and I see that we had some in, so I'll and Ryan Mercer and ask that they reach out to you to answer those questions directly. And Kim, thanks for the support. We're very excited about the relationship with the Virginia Association of Independent Schools and look forward to finding ways that we can continue to make it grow. Thanks, everyone. Have a great day, and let's find a way to make this happen. Goodbye.
Bye.